Hi everyone, Susie here. Today's lesson is on Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And we have spoken about her before when we've been on our outings to the Florida Everglades. Today we're going to learn about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's life and why she is so important to the Florida Everglades and why she is so important to our community. So, while we listen to our lesson, I want you guys to think about some of these questions because they're questions that I'm going to ask you to be able to answer when we're done. So, our questions are: where did Marjorie Stoneman Douglas live? Where was she from? How did she end up in South Florida? Also, what is Marjorie Stoneman Douglas famous for? I've given you a small hint of what she's famous for in my introduction. What are the Florida Everglades? We've been there, but what exactly are they? What are the Everglades often called, and who named them that? What is right down the street from the Wow Center that is named for Marjorie Stoneman Douglas? And what newspaper did Marjorie Stoneman Douglas work for? So think about those questions while you listen to my lesson and be prepared to answer them. Because if you can answer the questions, then I know that what I'm teaching you is staying in there, right? Okay, so Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was born on April 7th, 1890. April 7th is just in a few days. So she would have celebrated her birthday. We'll do the math and figure out how old Marjorie Stoneman Douglas would have been. She was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and she graduated from a very famous university called Wellesley. And she graduated with straight A's. In fact, they gave her the honor of being the orator when she graduated. And that means that she was the speaker for the class, essentially. In 1915, after a mess of a marriage, she came to Miami because she was invited by her father to come to Miami. She wanted a fresh start. And Miami back then, back in 1915, looked very different than it looks today. Today we've got lots of houses everywhere. Miami is a very big city. There are parts that are part of the city of Miami, which are like, by Brickell and Wynwood District and all of that. Those places that we've visited with our CBE outings. But Miami back then was very spread out, and the city was very small, much smaller than it is today, that's for sure. Her father was one of the people who had started a very famous South Florida newspaper, our local paper, the Miami Herald. And he invited Marjorie to come to Miami and to work for him at the paper. And so Marjorie did that. She, like I said, wanted a fresh start after a bad marriage. So she came down here, and at first she was a society reporter. And society is the community that you live in. So she was a community reporter, and she talked about community things and who was famous in our community, what did they do, what parties were happening, and those kind of things that are very kind of superficial, right? It's not very deep reporting, it's not in-depth reporting, but that's where she started. She had a degree in English, like I have a degree in English, and so that's where she started her career. Then she went on to become an editorial page columnist, and those are editorials are stories that are just interesting, human interest stories, and then that was her job for a while. After that, she became a famous writer. She started contributing stories that were more important. And as part of her new life in Miami, she started to get to know the Florida Everglades. Um, she she started to discover the beautiful nature and explore the beautiful nature that we have here in South Florida. We're very lucky to have a specific kind of climate, which is called a subtropical climate, and that means that it is warm most of the time, that the temperature is good enough that we can live our life outdoors most of the time. So she started looking at the Florida Everglades, and because Miami was growing so much back then, she started to notice that something a little bit worrisome was happening to the Florida Everglades. So around that time, construction companies had decided that because our climate is a healthy climate, that people would want to move here and that we would want to expand or grow our communities. So in order to do that though, most of where we all live right now, like Kendall or Homestead or the Redlands, all places we love to visit with CBE, most of those places at that time formed a part of Everglades. And in order to build in those areas, um, the construction workers were having to build something called canals. And what canals do, we have them, a lot of us have them behind our homes. We've got all these artificial lakes. We've got canals certainly everywhere in South Florida. What a canal does is it's a trench that they build and then it drains the land. So all of the water that would have been flooding these areas like West Kendall or Homestead or the Redlands, places that were what is called marshy, and I'll show you in a video that I attached to this file what marshland is. Marshy means that there's a layer of water that is very close to the surface, right? It's and then tall grasses grow in it. So all of that land was marshland, and in order to make it buildable, they had to make it dry. And in order to make it dry, they had to cut those canals, zigzagging through all of South Florida, certainly the parts where we live. But a bad side effect of that is that when you drain the land and you build on it, you're telling the nature that lives there, bye guys, you've got to move out, right? We don't normally have alligators walking through our streets, even though once in a while they do make their way through. Well, the reason that happens is because they have been displaced. They've been kicked out of where they naturally live. And where they naturally lived in South Florida was the Everglades. So many of us see the nature that has its habitat or its home normally in the Everglades in our neighborhoods. I have found turtles crossing streets that I've had to remove so that they don't get run over. And in my neighborhood, for sure, once in a while, much more around this time, I see ibises and herons and all kinds of tall birds, those birds that have those very long legs. They are wading birds. And wading birds make their home in marshlands. Those legs are so long so that they can walk through the water and be able to hunt and fish for their food. So if you've seen any of these ibises in your neighborhood, that's what they're doing. They're kind of a little bit lost maybe. And they might be eating in your front lawn like the one that I saw yesterday in my neighborhood. So Marjorie Stoneman Douglas started to notice that the more we built, the more we were cutting back on that place that was the Everglades. And the Everglades were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And she was worried that if we didn't do something about it, they were going to disappear altogether. And she recognized that the wild population that lived in the Everglades, the animals and the birds and all of the life that lives in the Everglades was not going to have a place to be anymore. There's only one Everglades in the world and we've got it. So she thought, I need to preserve this. I need to fight to save the Florida Everglades. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, when she came, wanted her independence. Women back then, and remember we did our lessons on Florence Nightingale and Madame Marie Curie. Women back then, as I said before, were expected to be married, to raise a family, and that was it. They weren't encouraged to have a career or to have a job as such. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wanted that independence. She wanted to be independent. And because of that, some people have referred to her as a feminist. But Marjorie Stoneman Douglas didn't like for people to call her a feminist because she didn't see herself as a feminist. She said, I'd like to hear less talk about men and women and more talk about citizens. So in saying that, what she was saying is, it isn't that I'm this or that. It isn't, I'm not doing this because I'm a woman. I'm doing this because what I want is I want to be considered equal enough to be able to make my own choices in life and to be independent. Now, we know in our population and in our community that independence is very important because it's what gives us our sense of self-worth. Do I have the ability to make my own decisions in my own life and live according to those decisions? And that's what independence means. It means that you stand on your own 2 feet and that you contribute to your own life. You don't just let everybody else make those decisions for you. So that was what she wanted. As she's learning about South Florida, and she joins a committee to try to make the Florida Everglades a national park. And what that means is that the President of the United States and the government of the United States, the whole United States, sets aside that territory and doesn't allow building on it. It kind of protects it. And it makes it a place where everybody can go visit and everybody can learn about it and experience it. And there are many national parks in the United States, such as Yellowstone National Park, which some of you may have been to on a family vacation maybe. And she wanted the Florida Everglades to be a national park as well. So she started working to that, and they formed a committee to try to get the government to pay close attention to them, to protect that land, to stop all of the building, because the more the buildings kept coming in closer and closer and closer to the Florida Everglades, and they were just going to take over altogether. So in 1947, finally, the Florida Everglades were declared a national park. And once that happened, the boundaries of the Florida Everglades became very clearly defined, and laws were put in place that would not allow building after a certain point of the Florida Everglades. And there were some compromises made. You could build to here, but beyond that, that's all protected land now. And you know that you and I have probably visited the Florida Everglades together because we love heading over to that wilderness and seeing the different animals that we see. And we'll talk about some of the animals that are in the Florida Everglades later. But that same year, she wrote a book. She published a book. When you publish a book, it means that they make it into a book and then they can sell it and people can read it. And the book was called Florida Everglades River of Grass. Okay. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was approached by someone about writing a book about South Florida. And originally, they wanted her to write a book about the Miami River. But she said, I'm not writing a book about the Miami River because it's a very small river. It's not very significant. And there's not really a lot to say about the Miami River, she thought. But she said, can I write it about the Everglades instead? And it was agreed that she could write the book about the Everglades. But because they had asked her to write a book about the Miami River, she thought, hey, wait a minute. The Everglades is like a river because it's a body of water that's constantly moving. Um, it comes from other rivers in Florida together with Lake Okeechobee, right? Lake Okeechobee is that big lake that we've got kind of in the center of the state. And we measure what our water supply is according to the height of Lake Okeechobee. If Lake Okeechobee gets very low, then we know that we have to conserve our water because that means that our water is getting low. So she decided she was going to refer to the Florida Everglades as a river of grass. Can you think why she would call it a river of grass? Because normally those are two separate things, right? Grass, river. She called it a river of grass because underneath all of that grass that you see in the Florida Everglades is water. And that water is constantly moving. And that is why there is so much life in the Florida Everglades. If you've been there with me around the springtime, there are so many birds and so many sounds, and there's even some wildlife. We see deer. There is even some wildlife that we don't see because it's under that tall grass, but it feeds all of that wildlife. So there's all kinds of fish under there. There are certainly snakes. Ooh, I wouldn't want to run into one of those. There are, like I said, beautiful birds, and there are alligators, which South Florida is known for, and crocodiles and manatees. And all of that life feeds on the Florida Everglades, right? So the fish will feed on the algae that grows on the grasses, and then, excuse me, and then the birds come and feed on the fish, and then the alligators can feed on the fish, they feed on otters, they feed on birds, right? It's the circle of life. And our beautiful, peaceful manatees feed on the grasses as well. So Marjorie Stoneman Douglas came up with the term river of grass, and she called it that because there's water constantly moving like a river under all of that grass. And to this day, when people talk about the Florida Everglades, that's what they call it, the river of grass. So in the 1950s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers came up with a major construction program, and they started building all of those canals, and they started building levees. And levees, you might remember from a few hurricanes ago, Hurricane Katrina, levees are very important in keeping water controlled and controlling the flow of water. So in order to stop certain places from being flooded, we build levees and we build dams. And in South Florida, we also build pump stations, which are stations that pump water out of the ground to make it dry, buildable land. And the reason they were doing that is to make more agriculture in the state of Florida. Agriculture is growing things like vegetables, fruits, even decorative plants. A large part of South Florida agriculture is growing, for instance, palm trees that people are going to buy and use to plant in their homes. But also, certainly, if we've been to Robert is here, right? It's at the mouth of the Everglades. So it's on the way to the Everglades is Robert is here. And that is a farm stand. So it's a place where people who farm vegetables and fruits take their goods to be sold. And Robert has his own farm, right? We talk about that when we go to Robert is here. They farm their own fruits and vegetables as well. So all of that land was made dry by this 1950s scheme of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Well, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas did not like that, and they became her number one enemy, because if it was up to them, they were going to do that to all of the Florida Everglades, and she was not going to stand for that, right? She knew that if they continued with their plan, they were going to destroy all of the water flow for South Florida and all of that beautiful nature that came along with it. And it was going to upset the natural cycles on which our Florida ecosystem depends. So an ecosystem is a system of ecology or nature, right, that feeds each other. And it was also going to disturb the migration of birds. In the winter, a lot of birds move south for the winter because it's going to get awfully cold in places like New York or Connecticut or even the Dakotas or Canada even. So a lot of those birds move down south, and then we get to have them as visitors for the weekend. I mean, for the winter. We get to have them as visitors for our Florida winters, and you'll see large flocks of birds flying overhead when the weather starts to turn a little bit cooler. Those birds are all going to live and survive in the Florida Everglades, and if they don't have that place to go, they'll stop coming and they'll have to go further and further to try to get away from the cold, and they might not survive those trips. So it will affect how many birds go back the following year, because a lot of birds might die if they don't have the right ecosystem. It's everything balanced depending on each other, right? How much rain falls here is going to affect how many birds come down, because there will or will not be food. So early on, she recognized that the Everglades system depended not just on water from Lake Okeechobee coming down into the park, but also on the Kissimmee River, which feeds the lake. So if you've been to Orlando, you know that there is Kissimmee in Orlando. There's a Kissimmee River, and that was also feeding the Lake Okeechobee, and then Lake Okeechobee was also feeding the Florida Everglades. So in 1970, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas formed a group called the Friends of the Everglades, and she was the head of that organization. And that organization is responsible for making sure that the Florida Everglades are being taken care of, and that whenever any new laws are going to come up that are going to affect the Florida Everglades, that organization makes sure that there's somebody there looking out for the Florida Everglades to make sure that those laws are not going to limit the Florida Everglades or ruin them in any way. make sure that, for instance, waste isn't pumped into the Florida Everglades, because that could kill a lot of the animals that make their home there. So she knew all those animals, that all of those animals depend on the Florida Everglades, and that the migration of all those birds from the north also depended on the Florida Everglades. So that's a pretty big task, because it's a pretty big national park. In his introduction to her autobiography, Voice of the River, which was written in 1987, she wrote it in 1987, it's the story of her life. John Rothschild described her as she appeared at a 1973 public meeting about the Florida Everglades, when they were still trying to decide some of the laws around protecting the Everglades. And he said, I'm going to quote this directly because it's very interesting, Mrs. Douglas was half the size of her fellow speakers, and she wore huge dark glasses, which along with the big floppy hat made her look like Scarlett O'Hara as played by Igor Stravinsky. So he's saying she was kind of mannish, right? Like she was kind of like a guy, but she was wearing a big floppy hat. When she spoke, everybody stopped slapping mosquitoes and more or less came to order. She reminded us all of our responsibility to nature, and I don't remember what else. Her voice had the sobering effect of a one-room schoolmarm's. The tone itself seemed to tame the rowdiest of the local stone crabbers, plus the developers and the lawyers on both sides. I wonder if it didn't also intimidate the mosquitoes. The request for a Corps of Engineer permit was eventually turned down. This was no surprise to those of us who had heard her speak. So eventually, remember I told you that the Army Corps of Engineers in 1950 had started this project to continue to drain the Everglades. Well, in 1973, they were still trying to continue to drain the Everglades. In fact, that's been an ongoing battle here in South Florida. How much of the Everglades can we take over? And eventually, the request for a permit to continue to build into the Florida Everglades that they had put in 1973, that was denied, which is lucky for us, because thanks to that, today we have our beautiful Florida Everglades. And when this is all over, and when we can head back outdoors and we can start meeting again, I hope that we can continue to visit the Florida Everglades, and maybe we can even do a little bit of hiking on the Anhinga Trail, which is one of my favorite trails in the Everglades, because on the Anhinga Trail you can see all of the birds that come down to South Florida. So maybe around the fall we'll be able to visit, and then we could see some of those birds that we have as guests to South Florida that come from other parts of the country. And all of that is thanks to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Now, another piece of information that I haven't yet given you is that near the Wow Center, you know that corner where there is a CVS and there is a Walgreens and where Arby's is and TJ Maxx, that corner, that street is 72nd Street. And 72nd Street has another name. 72nd Street is also called Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. So in South Florida, there are many things named after Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. And the reason for that is that we consider her the savior of the Florida Everglades. I'm glad that you joined me to learn a little bit about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Attached to this video, you're going to find a video on the life of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, which has lots of pictures of the Florida Everglades. And one animal that I didn't mention, but that I would like to give a special shout out to, is the Florida panther, which also makes its home in the Florida Everglades. And if you've been with me to the Florida Everglades, you'll know that as we're heading into the Everglades, there's a sign that says Panther Crossing. And the reason there's a sign that says Panther Crossing is because we are entering its home. Now you need to keep an eye out because panthers are also a protected South Florida species. I hope you have a good day and I will see you next time. Bye.
I couldn't tell you when I first saw the Everglades. My first and my earliest impressions were always of this vast expanse of open sawgrass country with, in the southern part, the islands of what we call island hammocks of hardwoods situated on higher rock that was left when the water eroded the softer rock around it, higher islands shaped by the flowing water.
A woman with a vast amount of talents and skills, whose morals were ahead of her time, she became increasingly involved with southern Florida when a publishing company asked her to write a book about the Everglades. Through her use of literature, she was able to preserve an ecosystem that was unlike any other.
Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, a devoted writer and leading Everglades activist in the mid-20th century, took a stand by using her literary works to spread knowledge about the biology of the Everglades. She challenged the limited scientific knowledge that was leading to the destruction of a very important individual ecosystem in southern Florida, which in effect helped to create Everglades National Park, and several acts made with the purpose of furthering American environmental conservation.
After a simple life of living with her mother in Taunton, Massachusetts, graduating from Wesley College in 1912 with an English degree, and a rocky marriage that ended in divorce, Marjorie was invited by her father to join him in Miami, Florida. With this offer was also the chance to become a society columnist for the Miami Herald. However, these efforts became postponed due to Marjorie enlisting in the Navy during World War I and later joining the American Red Cross. After an honorary discharge 3 years later, she arrives back in Miami and begins voicing her opinions on conservation at a greater rate than any time before. She returns to her job at the Miami Herald, this time writing in a section labeled The Gallery. Notes of conservation are present in all of her works over the next 20 years. It was common to read of her characters finding themselves in nature and inspiring people to conserve what land they had. It was because of this that editor Hervey Allen visited Douglas to convince her to write a book about the Miami River. She originally declined the offer, saying that the river was simply too small to research, and then asked if she could write it on the Everglades. Allen agreed, and for the next 5 years she started to research the small amount of science associated with the Everglades, ultimately causing her to become a leading figure for its conservation and protection.
Marjorie Douglas was a complete stranger to the Everglades. Over the course of her 5 years researching for her book, later named The Everglades, River of Glass, she had to educate herself on an ecosystem that was entirely new to scientists and locals alike. This was a challenge that did not daunt Marjorie, and she welcomed it with excitement.
She was able to recognize that the Everglades work in a process of continual evaporation, in which moisture goes into the clouds and rains down over the Kissimmee River and Lake Okeechobee. The excess water drains into the Caloosahatchee River and later enters the Atlantic Ocean. She was one of the few people to deeply understand the fragility and importance of all parts of the Everglades and used this knowledge as the backbone for her book. During the same time, Douglas, along with other conservationists, joined together on a committee to decide the boundaries for what was to become the Everglades National Park. The final boundaries for the park were not agreed upon by all members of the group, but the Everglades National Park was still founded in 1947, around the same time that Marjorie's book was published. The creation of the national park was one of the first actions taken to protect the region, and allowed for future acts of conservation to be enabled. By this time, Douglas is completely endorsed in Everglades conservation. 3 years after the dedication of the national park, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers began a major construction program that consisted of canals, levees, dams, and pump stations. This project, located in the Big Cypress region, was intended to protect against seasonal flooding. Marjorie became very outspoken on this issue and helped to stop the development in 1951, 1 year after the project had originally started. She made a clear point to discuss how each part of the Everglades is interconnected and how a disturbance in one section can cause disarray for the whole ecosystem. It was not until 1969 that Marjorie made another significant landmark for conservation. Nearing 80 years of age, she established Friends of the Everglades, an organization that is still around today. It was founded with the intention of increasing support against developing the Everglades. However, at this time, Douglas established Friends of the Everglades to halt a jetport construction project that would jeopardize the flowing water within the Big Cypress region. Her actions were successful, and only one runway was completed before the development ceased. A year later, developers and farmers threatened to drain 240 square miles of Everglades. Douglas presented herself as a fierce opponent against a hostile crowd, and she eventually won their favor to not disrupt the Everglade ecosystem. Their projects were later moved a fair distance away from the Everglades.
In later years, Marjorie became increasingly involved politically for the conservation of Everglades and southern Florida. She supported the Coastal Barrier Resources Act, which would be enacted for control of barrier islands and beaches by decreasing development in 1982. By protecting these areas, the act would prevent development from spreading from the coastal regions into the Everglades. She also advocated the Save the Everglades program, which was designed to restore the natural water flow to the Everglades in 1983. Concurrently, the Dade County Referendum Environmental Preservation was passed with the help of Marjorie too, establishing a $90 million fund to buy and protect endangered creatures in the region.
In the years before her death, Douglas was awarded with the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bill Clinton in 1993. It celebrates her devotion to the Everglades and her passionate commitment to the fragile yet undeniably important ecosystem. This in turn helped to strengthen America's respect for the environment and the delicate balance of nature. Americans will follow her in protecting the grace and wonder of all ecosystems for all to come.
Marjorie died 5 years later in 1998 at the age of 108. Her actions towards the environment continue to make an impacting change, especially the creation of Friends of the Everglades. She helped to pass several conservation acts and projects and stop countless others. Her literature instilled a passion within people to safeguard the environment by detailing the beautiful balance of nature and opening it up to everyone. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was the grandmother of the Glades.
And they went over our heads in flocks and flocks and flocks to where they were nesting. And they kept going over in the sunset and in the twilight, and then the full moon rose, because we'd planned to be there at the rising of the full moon. And so we could see them first against the sunset. We were so excited we were all standing up in these little rowboats. It must have been 3 or 4. He was in the last boat, and at the last minute, Dr. Bumpus fell overboard. So that was the climax of that. And fortunately, we were in the women were in the forward boat, so we couldn't. They had to rescue him and take off his clothes and try to get him some dry clothes. People contributed what they could. But poor Dr. Bumpus, he was so excited by the birds, he was exalted. People would say, "Oh, more birds, more birds." And that's when he fell overboard. So that was very funny.
with those questions that I gave you at the beginning of the video. So our first question is, where did Marjorie Stoneman Douglas live? Can you remember where she lived? Well, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was born in Minnesota. However, she moved to South Florida, specifically to Miami. So very good, you remembered. The second question is, what is Marjorie Stoneman Douglas famous for? Marjorie Stoneman Douglas is what today we would call a conservationist. So what she did is she ensured that the Florida Everglades would be protected. And she worked pretty much the rest of her life to try to make that her mission. She also wrote a book called Florida Everglades, River of Grass. Question number 3, what are the Everglades? The Everglades, or the River of Grass, as Marjorie Stoneman Douglas called it, is a body of moving water that is covered by marshlands. That means that tall grasses and trees grow there. And that environment only exists, you guessed it, right here in South Florida. It's very unique, and so it's very important to protect it. What are the Everglades often called? The Everglades are often called the River of Grass, and that is a name for it that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas invented. Question number 5. What is right down the street from the Wow Center and named for Marjorie Stoneman Douglas? Southwest 72nd Street, which is right down the block from the Wow Center, is also called Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Isn't that interesting? What newspaper did Marjorie Stoneman Douglas work for? A lot of our families probably read the Miami Herald. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas's first job here in South Florida was working for the society pages of the Miami Herald, the newspaper that her father helped found. So there you go. Those are your questions. I hope that you remembered all the answers. See you next time.